Now that we've taken care of the basic layout of our part, let's start to add a little bit more detail. The first thing I want to do is add something that's a new feature for SolidWorks 2016, and that's add threads. Now in the past, we've been able to add sort of a cosmetic appearance of threads and holes, but 2016 now gives us the option to physically cut threads onto our parts. Makes for a much nicer appearance of a part, and for a small part like this, we can go ahead and do it without sacrificing too much performance. So to do this, we want to go up to Insert, down to Features, and down to Thread. Now, the first thing it asks you is for a thread location, but I highly suggest that before you do this, you go down to Specifications and you select the type of thread and the size of thread that you want. Because if you select something like a large diameter boss, like we're going to be doing here, and by default it comes in on an inch die number 0 by 80, that's a lot of threads that it's trying to cut on this big part. So you want to make sure that you select either the metric die or metric tap based on what you're cutting. Now in this case, we're doing external threads, so we want to select metric die. And in this case, we want to do an M30 by 2.0. And you'll also notice as we scroll down that there's some options for the thread method. We can cut the threads or we can extrude them. Now in this case, we're going to go ahead and physically cut them because we've modeled it to be 30 millimeters, which is the major diameter of this hole. Now we can go back and we can select the thread location. We're going to be selecting the upper cylindrical edge of the larger portion of the boss. Let's zoom in to see what the preview is showing us. If you go up to the upper left-hand quadrant, you'll notice that it shows a triangular profile. Now this is the thread profile it's going to be used to physically cut the geometry. I'm going to select the offset option, and I'm going to offset this upwards 5 millimeters. This allows me to start cutting the threads before it gets into any physical geometry. For the end condition, we're going to select blind and use 45 millimeters as our specific distance. Now in this case, we're going to go ahead and say OK, and we're going to take a look at the results. Now you can see here that we have a very nice physical thread cut in our part. Now a lot of times, by default, the actual view of the thread looks pretty bad. You might get some nice aliased edges on there. And what you want to do is you want to go up into your options, into document properties, over to image quality, and you want to set your resolution value higher. Now if you set this pretty low, you'll notice in the preview that we have a highly faceted part that shows a lot of deviations between each edge. If you drag it up, it shows that you're going to use more and more straight lines between each edge to get a much higher quality image of a circular edge. Now, this also comes at a detriment. It's going to slow down the performance of your system. And if you're already running at the max, you might want to consider only turning this up to take a nice preview of your threads or maybe a screenshot and drag it back down. All right, now that we've taken care of the 30 millimeter thread, we also want to thread the smaller holes. Now these are 18 millimeter holes, but we want to use an 18 millimeter thread. So we have to consider the fact that we're using an 18 millimeter hole with an 18 millimeter thread. We're going to have to physically add threads in there. We want to go up to Insert, Features, and down to Thread again. Now in this case, again, scroll down, and under Type, we want to change from metric die to metric tap because we're going to be going on an internal hole. We want to change the size to M18 by 2.0. Now inside the methods, we have cut thread or extrude thread. We're going to select extrude thread because we're going to be physically adding them to the geometry rather than removing. Now we can select a hole location. Now as we look at this, I want to make a few notes here. Now it shows the profile, and if we rotate this around, you'll see that it's coming all the way through the part. We want to make sure that we change the end condition to up to selection and grab this bottom face. So that way we're not going too far. We also want to make sure that our end condition here for the extrude thread starts at the top and the bottom. Let's go ahead and say OK and take a look at the options. Now you'll notice that it says here, unable to extrude the thread on a cylindrical face. Now this is very important because what happens is the geometry of the thread does not work very well. Now typically when you're using an internal hole, you don't want to add the geometry. You want to physically cut the geometry. Now we're going to cut it and say OK, but we still have a less than ideal result. You see, it's starting the threads by cutting it before we get too far in. What we want to do is we want to come back, modify this, and use the offset option to start above. And I want to use the up to selection, but I want to use an offset option to offset below. This allows me to cut the threads before and after so that it has a nice lead into the thread like you would in reality when you're cutting these threads. Now, I should also note that it's a good idea when you're cutting internal threads, when you're physically cutting them, you want to make sure that you size your holes appropriately, that you make them the minor diameter of the hole or whatever it's set to be a drill diameter. So in this case, I'm going to select Cut Extrude 1, and you'll notice that we have our 18 millimeter diameter hole here. Now what I actually want to do is I want to change this to 17 millimeters, continue and ignore the error. So I will rebuild this, and you'll notice that everything updates fine. It just gives me an error because it modifies the hole that we have the cut threads on. The next thing I want to do is select the thread in the window, use my drop down, and do a circular pattern. I'm going to select for the parameters a circular edge in the center and say OK. Now when we say OK, if it does not work on your machine the first time, if we go back into the feature, you'll probably have to select geometry pattern. By default, this will be deselected, and it'll most likely give you an error or it'll pop up a warning saying that you are not able to do this. So just note that if you have problems, to select geometry pattern, and it'll allow you to pattern the cut for each of these holes. So now we've added the threads to the center boss, as well as the 6 holes that are going around our part. Let's go ahead and go back to an ISO view. And now it's a good time for us to save our part so we can move on to adding a bit more detail.